Hello everybody, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be talking about some gaming news which was announced just a few days ago on April 5th, but I've been a little under the weather and haven't been able to, make this video as quickly as I would have liked. But that news is the announcement of a brand new game from a studio that I've covered pretty extensively on this channel, and the game is called Strategic Command: American Civil War. This was announced on April 5th, and it's the newest game in the Strategic Command franchise, which, as I said, I've played on the channel quite a lot. I've played Strategic Command World War II, War in Europe, Strategic Command World War II, World at War, and Strategic Command World War I. And what this franchise is basically turn-based war games, which have hitherto looked at World War I and World War II, with, I would say, a strong emphasis in Europe. The most recent World War II game did have a global component where you were fighting in China and through the Pacific. I thought the China theater was pretty well implemented. I wasn't as sold on the island hopping campaign. I think if you were to ask folks, the pinnacle of the series was probably the Strategic Command World War II War in Europe, and then Strategic Command World War I. I think these games fit a narrower focus, and I don't think the Pacific Theater is as well modeled in the games. They're still good games, and I enjoy them quite a bit, though. And I think it's an interesting decision for the folks at Fury Software to go with an American Civil War game. You know, up to this point, one of the main things that I think World War I and World War II have in common for these games is big, long, solid fronts of soldiers. World War I famously with trench warfare, and even on the Eastern Theater, things are pretty static at times. The game itself doesn't leave a ton of room for maneuver. Things might be a little bit more spaced out in Russia in the World War I game, but still, it's a pretty cohesive front line. And that works because Strategic Command essentially is a game that has 2 week turns, although there's different scenarios with different rules. But the grand campaigns typically work on 2 week turns. They are I go, you go. So basically, one side does its turn, attacks the units it wants to attack, builds the stuff it wants to build, hits end turn, and then nothing happens at that point. It goes to the other side. And then, if it's the AI, they auto run through all of their orders while you sit and wait and watch what happens, or the human player enters in their orders, issues their stuff, and then it comes back to you. So there's no simultaneous resolution of results in this game. It's very much, again, it's I go, I order all my stuff, attack all my units, and then you go. And it's a hex-based war game series. Units typically, I believe, have a 0 to 10 strength. So there's no, you're not representing 100,000 soldiers or a division. They do give units like you're a corps or you're an army, but it's all still fairly abstracted. Units have values, attack values, if you will, defense values that are used to determine how combat works. You have different types of units in the World War II game. Obviously, you've got tanks, you've got heavy tanks, you've got infantry, you've got garrisons, which are weaker individual units meant mainly for like countering partisans and stuff like that. You have on the Eastern Front in World War II, you have partisans that can rise up and influence supply lines. Logistics is a big part of these games, like surrounding units allows you to rapidly deplete their available supply, and then you can destroy them in sort of a pocket. Air units are available in all of the World War I and World War II games, whether they be fighters or bombers or tactical bombers. And so it's very much a turn-based war game. And I would say it's a strategic level version of something like Panzer Corps, right? So like Panzer Corps, which is based off of Panzer General, are these hex-based, turn-based war games which look at individual battles or operations. Strategic Command takes that concept of a little bit of beer and pretzel, somewhat approachable and simple, and it takes those, hit point-based, hex-based, sort of abstracted out combat, but it's sort of trying to figure out the right mix and match of units to break through or destroy enemy units. It takes that concept up to the strategic level. So now you're looking at entire fronts, and you're looking at a much greater number of, maybe not necessarily a greater number of units, but representing a much greater aspect of the conflict. And you're trying to figure out in the World War I game, how do you break through trenches? How do you wear down the enemy? You know, you can do things like research and development and focus on things like gas technology or tanks, or, you know, in World War II, you can focus on better equipment, better tanks. And so the reason I'm giving all of this overview here is this type of game, I think, works really well in a global conflict. And that's why I had kind of assumed, I wasn't sure what they were going to do next. I thought maybe they would do a World War III game. I thought that could work really well. You know, you've got all these same sort of front mechanics, especially if it's early in the Cold War, but even late. You know, even the World War II games, they have some abstracted sense of rocketry. So you could probably do, you know, Scuds or intermediate range ballistic missiles. The game is probably not suited to nuclear conflict. But I think it's interesting that the game is going to be focusing on the American Civil War. And that's interesting because I don't know how well suited the engine is to that. I'm excited. Don't get me wrong. I've played a ton of this series on my channel. I've absolutely loved it. I think for a gateway drug into a lot of deeper war games, the Strategic Command series is could be really effective in bringing people in. I find myself enjoying this game. These games, they're easy to pick up, they're easy to play, they're not overly complex. There is a lot of complexity, right? Like they have convoys, they have assigning resources to lend lease. So like you've got an annual income or a bi-weekly income that you've got to use to reinforce units, to buy new units. You can send some of that off through convoys. You can interdict convoys. You know, there's a fair bit of complexity, more than just mash this 10 hit point infantry against this 10 hit point tank and, you know, wear them down with multiple attacks and try and force a breakthrough. There's a lot more complexity to the Strategic Command series than that. But it's still the kind of game you can sit down, you can learn, you can just pick up and play without having to read through a 300-page manual, and you won't feel overwhelmed about how the game works. It's pretty transparent. I think the design is pretty brilliant. I wonder, when you're bringing this back to the American Civil War, what that all entails. If we take a look at the announcement here, you can say, you know, they're commanding the they're looking at the American Civil War. Apparently it's their largest from a hex perspective map that they've ever done. It's a 296 by 224 hex map. It goes from Canada to New Mexico to the Caribbean. It allows you the ability to basically build armies, it seems, from scratch. I mean, they talk about the importance of building an army because, you know, at the start of the war, the American Civil War, neither side had professional armies. And so you're really looking at building your army up from scratch. So I think that'll be an interesting sort of component, because in all their previous games, there were already large standing armies that you were dealing with, and it was sort of focusing on balancing them out or focusing on the right tech. But you were never like, I don't have enough men for this conflict, outside of maybe the US. So it'll be interesting, you know, that the game says you need to organize units into brigades, divisions, and eventually corps. I don't know how that works in this system. You know, if you look at the screenshots they've provided, it looks like the same gaming system as they've used in all their other games. There's never been a sense of combining units to form bigger units. So maybe that's a new mechanic that they're going to be introducing. That should be interesting. Obviously, research is going to be really big because the American Civil War in many ways was the first modern conflict. And so I think, or at least in the American perception, I think you could argue Crimea really was, which was a few years before. But, you know, I think it'll be interesting. Research and development is going to be really key, right? The American Civil War, you start off with the armies mostly using Napoleonic smoothbore muskets, with the exception that they have percussion caps rather than flintlocks. And then by the end of the war, you've got basically what you would recognize today as like a Winchester repeater. You've got a repeater with a hand crank down at the base below the trigger. that allows you to fire off, you know, whether you're using a Spencer, I think that was 7 or 8 rounds, or the few soldiers who got the really expensive Henry rifles, you could fire like 14 rounds. But in any event, you had incredible firepower that was developed during the Civil War. You had rifled artillery, which really saw some of the first wide-scale use, I believe, in any modern conflict from an artillery perspective. There were even a handful of British Whitworth artillery pieces, which were breech-loading rifled artillery pieces. But then you still had things like the Napoleon smoothbore cannons, which are incredibly effective at short-range firing canister. So it's like this interesting merge of technology from the Napoleonics, while also sort of predicting what the late 1800s technology would start to evolve into what you ended up seeing tactics-wise from World War I. Units are still maneuvering in big block formations, but skirmishing becomes really vital. Cavalry is not launching any kind of like Napoleonic cavalry charges. U.S. cavalry wasn't trained well enough to do it, but the technology had already rendered things that would have been suicide. And so cavalry becomes sort of fast scouts out in front of infantry, and then raiding formations. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the game, it says you will be able to choose from a variety of famous generals. So I imagine those are the headquarter units, which tend to influence the ability to push supply forward. So you probably have like a Lee headquarter, a Jackson headquarter, a Grant headquarter, McClellan, or something like that. You know, it does say the fate of entire armies hinge on single battles. So I'm really curious about this, because in all of these, you know, I gave that 5-minute intro of their World War II and World War I games to sort of drive home the point that, like, they've always done these big front games where you don't win in an individual role. You don't hit one unit and then you win. It's grinding the enemy down. The 0 to 10 hit points, you hit them again. You hit them again. You know, they go 10 to 7, 7 to 5, 5 to 3, 3 to 1, 1 to 0. Unit destroyed. Now there's a gap in the line. You do that again. You've got a 2-unit gap, and now maybe you push some armor through and then swing around to try and cut off the enemy from their supply lines, and you've got a breach and you push through. And that doesn't fit for Civil War combat unless you're looking at battles at the tactical level. And so I don't see any indication here that the core of the combat is different. You know, there's a lot of information in here about riverine warfare, which I think this game could do a really interesting job. We'll talk about that in a second. Ironclads, newly reworked reconnaissance, the potential for European intervention. This is a game, by the way, that also these series of games are very heavily, they leverage events a lot. So like periodically throughout the game, whether it's a historical event or maybe an alt history event, you'll get a pop-up that'll give you some information, and then you have to make a decision, right? So like, for example, in the World War I game, they give you a pop-up that is about the Turkish battleships being built in England, and the British can choose to impound them and have them join the Royal Navy, and they get a couple new battleship units to join the fleet. But that's going to piss off the Ottoman Turk Empire, which will then, you know, very likely join the Germans directly because of that. Alternatively, you can choose to deliver the battleships to the Ottomans, but if you do that, there's no guarantee they won't still eventually come in on the side of the Germans. And if they do that, now they've got extra battleships on their side, you know, in the Mediterranean or in the Black Sea that you've got to deal with. And so, you know, these games are very interwoven with these events that pop up at different periods of time based on either triggers on what's happening on the map or based on just historical events. And so I would imagine you'll see the same sort of thing in this game for the Civil War. You'll probably get a pop-up like, do you want to institute the draft? You know, that'll hurt your national morale, which makes it, you know, harder to continue the war, but it gives you a big surge of troops. But is it going to influence the quality of those troops? You know, maybe they're whole new unit types that are conscripts versus volunteers. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But like, I think any war is suited for their system based on the events. And I think the Civil War is great for events. You know, you could also have war in Mexico. You know, the French are engaged in a war down there. So maybe there's the possibility of fighting them or European intervention, right? Like I would assume one of the events that'll happen is the Trent Affair, where the Americans stop a steamer that has a British diplomat on it, and sorry, Confederate diplomats on a British steamer, and it nearly led to war. You know, you could probably get the Americans or the Union into war with Britain if you go down the wrong event chains. But what I don't know, and we haven't really seen yet, is how they're going to handle the tactical battles, because there is this line saying that, it says the fate of entire armies hinge on single battles. The appointment of talented generals may well be the difference between victory and defeat. So if they're going to go with their sort of headquarter approach, I don't, okay. I mean, looking at these screenshots, like look at the screenshots that they've provided. It looks the same as their previous games. It looks like there's a solid front of troops. The American Civil War wasn't like that, at least not until the Siege of Petersburg, or maybe a little bit in the Peninsula Campaign. But like the Civil War were armies of maneuver. There weren't fronts per se. There were forts, there were theaters, but there was a lot of freewheeling maneuver that occurred within those areas. And so you didn't have the First Corps, the Second Corps, and the Third Corps stacked out across all of Northern Virginia, maybe in their camps, yes, but they didn't have the manpower to form like a solid line of troops over 40 miles of terrain. They would come together at one point. I think the Gettysburg front was like 2.5 to 3 miles for the entire Union position along their entire front for 90,000 soldiers. So if these hexes represent, 5, 10, 40 square miles, I don't know how you're gonna get that battle feeling right. I think the game can do a lot of interesting things, but we'll really have to see how they're gonna approach these tactical battles. Like if I attack one corps and the result is really good and one hex, does it cause all the other troops to lose their morale and now have to withdraw? I don't know what this means where it says entire army's fates are decided by individual battles. I guess we'll have to see. I mean, I'm not downcrying the game. It's just this is just a very different type of war than they have modeled before. It doesn't mean it can't be done. The Commander the Great War was a series I played on the channel several years ago from a completely different developer. Similar concept to Strategic Command. And they had a Napoleonic game, which I think I never played, but I heard it was okay. So like it's a similar challenge, I would imagine. So it'll be interesting to see how they do this. It looks like there's going to be 6 different campaigns: 1861 Blue and Gray, 1861 Manassas to Appomattox. So I'm assuming one starts at the outbreak of war where you've got to build armies from scratch. The other, you've got some armies in place, and so you've got to fight it. 1862 Scott's Great Snake, which is the the Anaconda campaign. The 1862 Trent War, which I'm assuming is like a hypothetical war with the British if they recognize the Confederacy during the Trent Affair. 1863, which is the Gettysburg campaign, Lee rides north. And then 1864, Make Georgia Howl, which is Sherman's raid, or not raid, but invasion into Georgia during the March to the Sea. It does say that there will be new unit types, including balloons, which is pretty cool, presumably for scouting, and I would assume that would mix in with like the new reconnaissance mechanisms. Rangers, which I don't really, maybe they're like raiders, I don't know. I'm not really sure what the Rangers would be doing in the Civil War. Monitors, river gunboats, and many more. I'm excited to see how they model riverine warfare, because for my comments and perhaps concerns or just questions about how they're going to manage the tactical combat for land combat, I do think one of the interesting things that the Strategic Command series has is this concept of trade routes, which are represented on the maps by these lines that indicate where supplies and trade is flowing through. And so if you're the American, in the World War II and World War I games, if you're the British, you want to set troops or ships on those lanes. If you're the Germans, you want to put U-boats on those lanes for the British. And it directly influence the war. You can reduce the enemy's economic activity. You can, accomplish a lot by doing that. I would imagine as the Union, you definitely want to do that as well. It looks like on some of these screenshots that you're going to have trade routes from different Confederate ports, which probably represent blockade runners or fast transports trying to sneak out of these ports and get to the Bahamas or get to Nassau, which is in the Bahamas, and trade with the British or the French, and then sneak supplies back in. Like this was a big part of the war, was the Union's attempt to shut down the Confederate ports so that they could sort of strangle the South's economy and force the South, away from Europe and away from the support that could be leveraged there, because the Confederates had an underdeveloped local industry. They largely equipped their armies, or a lot of their equipment for their armies came from Europe. So did for the Union as well, but the North had factories that could churn out all the weapons they needed eventually. The South really didn't. And so huge shipments of Lee Enfield rifled muskets, and to a lesser extent some artillery would come in, as well as ammunition and other things like that through these ports. And so I'm curious to see how they model the naval combat. I think, having Union naval ships that have to sit on these convoy routes, you could have events like rough seas or other things like that that drive ships off the convoy routes that give blockade runners a chance to get out. Obviously, you can have naval combat between ironclads, perhaps being largely invulnerable to wooden ships. So you could definitely recreate sort of the short-lived attempt to break the blockade at Norfolk with the Monitor, or not the Monitor, the Merrimack, or CSS Virginia. But so I think that's interesting. I also think it'll be pretty cool if there's an element of amphibious warfare where you're trying to batter down enemy forts or land troops and take those forts and take those ports. So you could take individual Confederate ports along the coastline, hold them against Confederate counterattack, and then, cut off supply that way. Because that was really the effective way to stop the blockade runners, was to take the ports, which the Union did slowly over time. So I think the naval combat element of it could be really, really interesting. And I see indications there's going to be forts on these screens. And I definitely see indication there's going to be these convoy routes. Presumably, maybe you can also smuggle supplies through Mexico through this strategic map that allows you to allocate resources to different convoys or trade routes. That would be something I would think. I imagine there will also be diplomacy, which the previous games had as well, trying to bring, other powers to your side. But yeah, I'm really curious to see like what this does, or how this game approaches things. Apparently there are partisan scripts as well. So there could be, the ability to have partisans, maybe like in Missouri or other places like that, where there was a lot of irregular warfare. Certainly interesting. So I guess really it remains to be seen. I know I think I probably started this video sounding somewhat skeptical. I think, if you listen through, I'm just really curious to see how they approach this, because I would not have thought that the Civil War would have been the next direction that they go. But if you follow the channel for any period of time, you'll know I'm a big Civil War buff, and I think I just want to make sure, they get it right and it feels right. I think it's going to be important to have a sense of maneuver and the ability to sort of outgeneral your opponent. I don't know whether the game will do that or not. I guess we'll find out. A lot, I think, is going to depend on how the game models, that aspect of individual armies' fates hang out in individual battles. I don't know. There should be huge gaps in the lines in the West, and it seems like there are based on the handful of screenshots we have. And I really think there could be a great sense of driving home the strategic realities of this game, right? Like, this game could be really well suited to the Riverine campaign to cut the Confederacy in two. What are the impacts of that? What are the impacts of taking the Mississippi? What are the impacts of trade and being cut off from access to the Confederacy's western states? The ability to slowly lock down the Atlantic ports with various operations. I think all of that is really encouraging and could be very well modeled. What I worry about is how the individual large battles are going to be handled in the Eastern Theater, between the principal armies of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, or the Army of the Tennessee, and the various Union armies in sort of the central and western theaters. But I guess we'll see. Time will tell. I have enjoyed every game that I've played that Fury Software has put out. I've enjoyed all of these Strategic Command games. I think it's really exciting to see the Strategic Command series revitalized. It had been very stale for a long time before Strategic Command World War II War in Europe came out. What was that now? 5, 6, 7 years ago? But before that, the series had vanished for a long time, and they got a new developer. They got under the Matrix and Slytherin umbrella. They had previously been under Battlefront, I believe. And you know, they had really put a lot of care and effort into these games. I mean, I think they look pretty good for the style of turn-based game that they are. I think they're well designed. And I guess it just remains to be seen how they approach the Civil War, because this is new for them. They've never branched out in the entire series' history, which is over 20 years long. To my knowledge, they've never branched outside of World War I or World War II. So we'll see how they handle it. I'm excited to see what comes of it, but we'll definitely be following this closely on the channel. With that being said, guys, that's enough of me rambling. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave your thoughts below. Let me know what your thoughts are on the direction that the Strategic Command series is taking, and we will certainly keep you posted and keep an eye on this as this news develops. Until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'm out.